I am very pleased to introduce the next session. This was going to be a talk by Alec Waterhouse. Unfortunately, Alec is indisposed, but I'm really pleased that at a very last moment, Tony O'Connor has agreed to step in his place. Tony is the head of the Government Operational Research Service, so in some senses is the boss of everybody who's in OR in the government, including, I might say, Alec Waterhouse, I think.
Directly.
And he's also a senior strategy advisor in the Department of Health. And Tony, what's relevant to the talk today is that Tony was a member of the steering group of the Macpherson review of models in government. And Tony will be telling you more about that and issues of quality and validation in his talk. So, welcome, Tony O'Connor.
Okay, thank you. Of course, anything that you don't agree with, I will refer back to Alec, and anything you like is entirely mine, okay? So, famous statistician, George Box, essentially all models are wrong, but some are useful. And there's something that we'll be hearing about today. It's not necessarily about the result of the model that's important, but it's actually about the process of doing the modelling, which increases the insight and understanding of what we're actually covering. Now, how do we make them useful? What Alec was going to cover today was a brief sort of introduction, something about the environment, a little bit about some typology of types of model, and some quality assurance and management issues. And I think here I'm coming very much from the government perspective about how the culture and the environment has changed now within the sort of Whitehall's scenarios. So there's this change models for government, a bit of focus on assurance, something about the context of the model, and it was interesting in some of the issues that we heard earlier. There's a lot of experimentation because it will help us understand how the system might work, but actually sometimes you need to think about what is the question you're actually trying to answer or address and whether or not that model is appropriate. Some issues there about complication and complexity, and I'll come back to those, and the need that we need to be transparent, particularly in the government environment now, about our assumptions. Some of you will have seen these headlines. On the left, we've got civil servants suspended after government is forced to rerun bidding process. Well, actually, they weren't actually civil servants. They were people who were brought in to do the work, but there was still an issue about our processes and procedures inside Whitehall and doing that quality assurance. And as I suppose most of you know, it all blew out of all proportion when Virgin came back and actually talked about the assumptions on the West Coast mainline work and then said, we don't think your model's right. And actually the process went, we're sure it is, don't worry, go away. And then they just went public on that, and Virgin were right, and I'll say collectively we were wrong, and we had to sort things out. It wasn't good, wasn't a good process. I think there's been an awful lot of self-reflection, but what it has brought about is a complete change to the modelling culture in its broadest sense that's going on through government departments at the moment. The consequence of that was the Laidlaw inquiry in December 2012 into the West Coast franchise deal itself, and then the Macpherson report, of which I was part of the steering group, which was published in March last year, just over a year ago. The Macpherson report is available on the Treasury website or the gov.uk website now. And I just want to focus on that diagram. I hope you can read it. It talks about effective QA of models. And there's a chunk on the right-hand side that you'll all probably be very familiar with about the process, the guidance, and the documentation. The sort of traditional stuff that sort of the pointy heads amongst us, and I say that with affection, are quite used to and actually want to make sure is in place. But there was a big issue as well around that modelling environment on the far side over there. So the culture, capacity and capability and the control. So actually, do we have the right environment to do the modelling? Do the stakeholders, do the customers, do they actually appreciate what they're asking and whether a model is the right type of process for that? Do they know and understand how they're going to learn? And in the capacity and capability, we all like to think we can build models, but actually do we have the right skills about the right modelling techniques? And we heard a number of different processes this morning, and I suspect that many people here will probably know their way around one or two of those, but won't know their way around all of them. So actually making sure you're not applying your same old tool to every single problem you meet is a good lesson for all of us as analysts. Outcome, I'll just, oh, sorry, excuse me. They are, as I said, they're not my slides. I'm don't know all the builds. The outcome is there's been an increased focus on models, and that the modelling assurance actually implies to internally and externally develop models relevant to some of the issues here today. So just because the models are commissioned from people outside, we need to make sure the assurance procedures are in place. Large and small, slow and fast. I mean, models are used for all sorts of things. There's a process which we're now carrying out to identify what we would call business critical models and making sure the right procedures in place. Interestingly, business critical is up to the department to define, and simply can be defined in a very simple way, which is risky. Anything which would involve any significant financial or possibly political embarrassment of risk would be regarded as a business critical model. But you can see how that could be extended to make sure you put the right validation and verification procedures in place for a number of others. Types of model, I'm probably teaching to the choir here. Different purposes: resource allocation, forecasting, financial modelling, science, policy outcome. You'll have seen some examples of these already today. Processes are different. Exploration and concepts, projections, uncertainty. Basically building up more understanding of a system is what I would say that modelling provides the most benefit for. Fast and measured, there are plenty of examples. I always thought about the plain packaging example from the Department of Health is to create more space for the models developed on the back of the packet. But there are some more detailed models and more complex models that have taken years to develop and actually refine. And software, there is a variance in software, but predominantly most of the modelling done in government would still be done on the basis of spreadsheets. There are some dedicated software tools in some departments and they make very good use of them, but still the vast bulk is in that sort of spreadsheet space. This is a diagram, and I'm glad Alec has credited at the bottom, which you probably can't see, which is from Jeff Royston, who's in the middle of the room there, just as a help to understanding the different sort of influences of modelling and processes around them. So you can imagine different types of models which are sort of run by an individual for an individual, and you can think about that axis on the vertical scale, and you can do some analysis down here, some mathematical models. But actually, as you move towards more of a group dynamic system, the models become more qualitative and soft. And what I want to sort of emphasize here is it isn't always about finding the number. It's about developing the understanding and understanding how the system works and how it interacts. And you can see there, you'll probably recognize the spectrum of different types of models there that a number of you will be very used to. And then you get to sort of the issues around complication and complexity. And Alec was keen to sort of emphasize the point that these are often interchanged and probably misused. There are lots of simple systems out there which we probably go away and model, and we probably didn't need to because it's an obvious conclusion and it doesn't really require that extra sort of verification in the process. So we overcomplicate some of the systems when they don't need to be actually modelled in the first place. But then there are complex systems when the relationship between cause and effect can only be perceived in sort of in retrospect but not in advance. And what you're really trying to do is sort of probe, sense and respond, as opposed to sort of sensing, analysing and respond. So actually you're trying to test the system and seeing what would actually reaction. And then you get chaotic systems in which there is really a non-understood relationship between cause and effect, or no relationship between cause and effect. And in that sense, it becomes a very different type of modelling system that you're trying to actually play with. A number of you will have seen this, or a variant of this, and this is the modelling cycle. And I just want to talk about sort of embedding quality throughout that overall process. So reality, if you look at that, I mean, you'll recognise those individual stages, and I'll come to them individually. Life isn't as well structured as that, and sometimes we can shoot around that cycle really quickly, or actually get bogged down in one particular area of that cycle for months on end, as we're still arguing the relatively nuances about the scope of the system that we're trying to actually quantify. I'm putting them all up, so I've got them there. Okay, documentation. Presumably you're teaching this to you that you would say that you'll understand this. The number of times I've picked up or taken over from somebody else's piece of work and they say, well, it's all quite simple really, it's all in the model, you can read it all there, and then you go in and you realise that they're off sick or they've left their job or they're no longer contactable and they've quite happily deleted their forwarding email address, and you realise, I don't understand a word of what's in this model, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. There is an important aspect around modelling which is about the transfer of knowledge. And that's not just from the expert who understands the system but can't model it. but it's also back from the modeler who can interpret the system and then translate that for others who can then benefit from that overall process. So it's about helping a non-analyst use it, it's about helping an analyst use it, and it's about allowing it to be rebuilt in different ways, which can really help with validation and verification to make sure your methodology itself isn't flawed. And all of that can help to actually mitigate the risk and provide evidence to others internals for external scrutiny and to auditing. So, scope and specifying. I'll run through these fairly quickly. Scope is fairly obvious. You want to list the objectives. There was talk earlier about examining the modelling space. I do think there's a lot to be said for actually making sure we understand what the problem is that we're trying to fix before we go ahead and try and build a model in order to understand the system. If it ain't broke, well. Specify, writing a model spec, creates a definitive statement of what the model will do, and importantly, what it won't do. Quite often there's an over-reliance on some models to give them an answer in a certain space when actually there's some key assumptions and limitations of the model which mean that it's not actually appropriate. And then there's the issues around documentation, which I've already covered, but very helpful often to have sort of pictorial representations to understand the model. And again, good illustrations of those in the earlier sessions today. In design and build, good design, logical flow, easy to understand, easy to develop. If it's modular, that makes a lot more sense. It makes it easier to actually correct and build different parts of the model. And I think it was the last talk this morning, which was talking about how we might link different modelling of processes to each other, which becomes a very powerful tool rather than using the same kind of modelling process for the whole system. Making sure your build stage is quick and easy and simple and less prone to errors is really helpful, but also understanding it still needs to be fit for purpose and do the task it's been set out in terms of the specifications and the original scope. If you're going to populate something, you're putting things into models. Oh, God, the number of times I've walked into a spreadsheet and looked at the fact that there's a numbers hard-coded into the system and you just hate it and you realise how much of a problem that creates. Use transparency, use names, include units, put a data log in. Again, these are all simple processes. But quite often when you go back and look at other people's models, they're not there, which makes it really complex for that knowledge transfer later on. Test and sign off. This is probably, again, an obvious element. But actually, how do you test your models? Do you get other people to look at them? Sometimes we're quite proud and we're quite defensive of what we've actually built. So how do we make sure that others have actually done that peer review for us? And that could be internal, it could be external, bringing in external players to help. And obviously there's some sensitivities around that. But also making sure that there's some different levels of testing, from the sense tech, does it actually look sensible at the end of that process, to full code and logic reviews, or even possibly shadow model building, building in different systems or different approaches in order to see whether you get the same results. Testing it with test data, reference data, dummy data, all those kind of things. And going back and actually collaborating it with the end user to see whether they also make sense for them, rather than you just as the modeler itself, and to seeing whether it is credible. Key points for use. You need a user guide. Again, fairly obvious. But understand the wider risk considerations. Often when we hand over models, because it's a good thing to do, because it increases understanding, but you hand over models to stakeholders and policy colleagues and clients who are reasonably intelligent people, but then the model starts to get used for processes that it wasn't designed for. And it's that simple, they will take a number of the model but don't understand that they actually should be giving some kind of error around the overall end result of that process. So they use it, the figures end up in a speech, and then we all end up with difficulty in terms of our jobs. Think about the customer. Not all the customers have the same level of understanding. And I've never met a senior policy person in government who hasn't said that they're really good with numbers. So think about the limitations, making sure you're helping them understand what those conclusions are. On the review, version control, fit for purpose, I'm not going to go through all of those there. But apart from the last one, there is something about making sure there's a sunset clause in various models to understand if there's a time element when they are no longer valid, when things have moved on, and when you want to actually make sure that actually those assumptions do need to be reviewed on a 6-month basis or a quarterly basis or an annual basis, whatever they might be, particularly if they've got some financial indicators which are quite key So recently, I think it was the other day, there's some the new revisions around the cost of the student loans model, for example. You're looking at that, you can actually see that changing some of the underlying financial assumptions there have changed the assumptions about what the rate of payback is going to be. And it has quite significant consequences for the overall policy. So the key takeaways for today I sort of put up there are that the environment in government has changed. Every department will now have a particular working group who will be looked to there to quality assure the processes for assuming their models are appropriate and they're used in have the right systems around them. There is that greater focus on assurance and that assurance process. And there's something there, and the last point I want to make is that appetite for models depend on context. Policy timelines, we're what, 377 days to the election. You need to understand how people are going to use that information which feeds into that policy process. So actually coming up with a model, and it's a key thing about modelling and analysis as it's overall, if you have a piece of analysis which is going to generate the perfect result tomorrow, but they take the decision today, your analysis is useless. So you need to make sure your modelling is timely, fit for purpose and appropriate with the right caveats around it as you might need. Do understand the risk, do make sure you understand the variability in some of your models, and make sure you are communicating clearly, probably covering with written communication and backing it up what it is fit for purpose, what purpose is fit for and what purpose is not fit for. The model results can, the back of the envelope calculations, they always end up turning into something much bigger than they were originally intended. And that's a useful thing to actually take away. So, that was all that Alec put in his slides, so that's all I'm actually going to cover, but I'm very happy to take any questions around modelling or the government environment, Macpherson Review and anything else. There's a question right at the back.
Yes. Is there any move towards some policy for making models open in the same way as for making data open so that academics can be involved in the critique and development of models happening within government?
Yes. I would say it would be very difficult for government to have every part of its modelling and assumptions opened up on a transparent basis, particularly when it's in policy development mode. I would say that on the modelling of the critical systems, I know of some in DEC, I know of some other departments where they are open up to, they're under particular arrangements, but they are open up to peer review from academia, and we have academics involved in actually reviewing those processes. So there's a spectrum. It wouldn't be appropriate for every spreadsheet to be put out there. I don't think that would serve anybody any benefit, but the large models are definitely open up for more peer review, and that was a direct recommendation in the Macpherson report, so where it wasn't already happening. I can't give you a specific list of which ones they are, though. If you were interested, you could go onto the Treasury website and look at the Macpherson Review from last year. The models reflected the previous 12 months, so they were 2012 to 2013, and it actually listed the different quality assurance processes that were in play for those business critical models. Any others? Yes.
You said that there was an appetite for models. I don't know, as per the government circles or whatever it is. And the question is, what kind of models?
I would say there's an appetite for better solutions and understanding, and modelling can facilitate that process. I don't see many policy people saying, oh, please come and model this for me. They come and say, what's the answer, or what's the particular improvement that we can do, or how can we overcome that particular barrier? So there's an increased emphasis on understanding the systems, the complex systems that we were talking about earlier, because most government problems aren't simple, they're complex, otherwise they'd have been solved ages ago. So that's where the increased appetite comes in. And with the more sophisticated tools and techniques that we're all learning about continually, that means that we can provide more sophisticated solutions. You look sceptical.
Yeah, because there are so many different kinds of models, and I just
Oh, yeah.
if not necessarily centered around our interest, but for example, there is scientific models, physics and chemistry.
Mm-hmm.
Are they also?
Yeah, I mean, they were also under review in the Macpherson report. So those systems, if they are there, if decisions are being taken on the outcomes of those models, the right quality assurance procedures do need to be in place. I'm not an expert in this area. Maybe Alec might be able to cover more of this. But for example, the debate around the Somerset levels and whether or not dredging of the rivers was a good or a bad idea would have been based on some modelling of what we would have understood about the impact of dredging and what the impact would have been on further parts of the Somerset levels and further down the river system. Now, I don't understand the modelling there, not my area, but you can see how that was being used in a live scenario in order to inform policy about what we would need to do to cope with, at that time, what was a significant emergency. Any others? Yes, in the middle. Yes.
What plans are there to improve, increase stability of the model building development?
They're different, I would say, around. Different departments have different levels of expertise. I mean, I know about the operational research profession. We've also got economists, statisticians, social researchers, and the various ranges of different hard scientists and the physical scientists, all of whom will have different levels of expertise. Certain departments are more expert in certain types of modelling, so that's because of the nature of their business. And we actively try and manage our community in terms of moving people around, so there is actually we sharing some of those ideas and those techniques. And events like this and internal events which allow us to actually share best practice help that process. What I would want to emphasise, though, and I did say it very briefly in the talk, is it's making sure that if you know one area of modelling, that's not the area you keep using for every problem you meet. You actually have to be open to understanding there are different approaches and different solutions and getting other people to help you develop them. I do think there's an issue in the sort of longer term. I mean, I'm doing some separate work on big data, data science and data analytics and what the potential of that's going to be. I think government is still lagging behind in some of those particular skills in that area. There is a question about how much government needs big data. It has large data sets, whether it's in the same space as all of the big data environment. But there's a skills gap there which we're actively looking to see how we can plug. Yes?
Following on that, what about the capacity capability of people who are using
Yeah, it's done. The report itself put in place that there needs to be a senior responsible officer, non-analyst, who was in charge of that model or the outcomes of that model. And therefore, each department would have been working on what is the appropriate level of training and support they need to do to make sure they're up to speed and they can actually ask the critical questions without making them feel uncomfortable or made to look a bit of an idiot in some cases. So the point there is to make sure that there is training on both sides of that analytical customer divide, if that makes sense. Any others? I think I managed to get you back on time, or you're on time.
Thank you ever so much, Tony. That was great.